Chicago in the 1920s wasn't a city so much as a crime scene that never stopped smoldering. The smell of bootleg whiskey and gunpowder hung in the air like the fog off Lake Michigan, and the law was mostly a suggestion. Men like Al Capone didn't just own the night, they owned the cops, the judges, and the headlines. In that empire of bribes and bullets was one of the most polished operators of them all, Edward J. O'Hare, better known to everyone who mattered as Easy Eddie. Easy Eddie was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of killers and come out with a contract and a compliment. He was Capone's lawyer, business manager, and fixer, the man who kept the cash flowing, the racetracks running, and the IRS guessing. To the world, he looked every bit the respectable gentleman, fine suits, silver tie clips, and a home in Chicago's best neighborhoods. He was charming, articulate, and very good at pretending not to hear the screams behind closed doors. He had one fatal flaw. He loved his son. Edward Henry O'Hare, called Butch since childhood, grew up surrounded by the contradictions of his father's world. There were chauffeurs, riding stables, and private schools, but also whispered phone calls, bodyguards with nervous eyes, and the constant hum of danger. Easy Eddie wanted his boy to enjoy the spoils of success without understanding their origin. But Butch wasn't stupid. Even as a child, he could read the tension in his father's smile. The Chicago newspapers called Capone the boss of the underworld, but around the O'Hare household, he was just Al. Capone liked Eddie, trusted him, at least as much as a man like Capone could trust anyone. Eddie managed the Hawthorne Kennel Club, one of Capone's fronts for gambling and tax shelters. When the feds started sniffing around Capone's books, Eddie was the one who helped disguise the ledgers. But behind the tailored suits and the fine cigars, guilt began eating at Easy Eddie like rust through steel. He was a Catholic, and every Sunday he sat in the pews with his son, pretending his soul wasn't for sale. He wanted Butch to have a clean name, an honorable life. But what legacy could a man like Eddie leave behind except money soaked in someone else's blood? So he did something rare in Chicago. He grew a conscience. By the mid-1930s, the walls around Capone were closing in. The Treasury Department had started to realize you could kill a gangster's empire with a calculator instead of a Tommy gun. Tax evasion was the weapon of choice. And who better to testify than the man who'd managed Capone's finances for years? Easy Eddie knew what that meant. He'd seen what happened to men who crossed the outfit. But something had shifted in him. Maybe it was the realization that Butch was almost grown. Maybe it was fear of dying with his soul in escrow. Either way, Eddie turned federal witness. He handed over Capone's financial ledgers, the same ones he'd once helped falsify. He didn't get a medal for it, he got a death sentence. By 1939, the FBI had what it needed. Capone was in prison, but the remnants of his organization were still very much alive, and very much angry. Eddie's name was mud in the underworld. His wealth couldn't buy protection anymore. He knew he'd eventually pay the price, but he kept sending Butch to better schools, telling him to stay out of Chicago, out of trouble, out of the life his father had built on sin. On the morning of November 8, 1939, Easy Eddie was driving his Lincoln Zephyr down Ogden Avenue, heading toward the courthouse. It was a cold, gray day, and the city looked half asleep. As he stopped at a red light, another car pulled aside. Witnesses said there was a burst of machine gun fire, then silence. The Lincoln rolled to a stop against the curb, riddled with holes. Inside, Easy Eddie slumped over the wheel, his rosary still wrapped around one hand. It was the classic Chicago ending, fast, loud, and final. The newspapers ran the story for days. Mob lawyers slain in Chicago ambush. The photograph showed a man who looked strangely peaceful, as if the guilt had finally drained from him. Among the wreckage of his car, police found two items, a religious medal and a dog tag engraved with his son's name. That was the legacy Eddie left Butch. Not wealth, not power, but a lesson. That doing the right thing might cost you everything, but it still had to be done. And so, while Chicago buried another ghost from the Prohibition era, Butch O'Hare packed his bags for military school. He was still young, but he'd already learned the first rule of honor. It doesn't come cheap. The boy who'd grown up in a gangster's mansion was about to learn what it meant to earn his own wings. Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, sat on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River, a quiet, disciplined world compared to the chaos of Chicago. The air smelled of brass polish and gun oil instead of whiskey and blood. That was exactly why Easy Eddie had sent his son there before his death. He wanted Butch to learn order, not hustle, discipline, not deceit. Butch took to it like a duck to water. He was athletic, bright, and quick with a grin that made him instantly likable. He played sports, led cadet formations, and picked up the nickname Butch for his rough and ready enthusiasm. The boy had a gift for leadership that didn't rely on intimidation, something rare in a school full of adolescent egos in pressed uniforms. He also had a fascination with anything that flew. Airplanes were still young then, clumsy, dangerous, loud, but to Butch, they were freedom incarnate. When other boys stared at the ground and dreamed of cars, he looked up and imagined wings. Even so, the shadow of Chicago was never far behind. The faculty knew who his father was. Some whispered about the irony of a mob lawyer's son in a school built to produce officers and gentlemen. But Butch earned their respect. He worked harder than anyone else, never using his father's money or name to his advantage. If anything, he tried to distance himself from it, as if every push-up or parade march could burn a little more of his father's sins away. He graduated in 1932, just as the Great Depression was crushing the country. Factories went dark, bread lines wrapped around the city blocks, and men with families slept under bridges. Yet Butch seemed immune to the hopelessness of the time. He'd already decided what he wanted, to serve. That same year, he was accepted to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, a ticket to legitimacy, discipline, and a future far from Chicago's grime. At Annapolis, Butch O'Hare fit right in, though not without trouble. He was sharp, physically tough, and instinctively competitive. He could navigate calculus and celestial mechanics with the same ease he handled a football or a pistol. But he also had a mischievous streak, a tendency to push rules just enough to remind everyone that he had a mind of his own. Demerits followed him like mosquitoes, but so did laughter. Fellow midshipmen liked him because he never acted superior. He didn't trade on his father's money, didn't show off, and never lost his sense of humor. He was the kind of man who'd help you cram for an exam, then pull a prank on you the next morning just to keep things interesting. What he didn't talk about was family. When others went home on leave, Butch often stayed behind. He wrote letters to his mother and occasionally to his father, but even those grew sparse. By the mid-1930s, Easy Eddie's cooperation with the feds was an open secret in Chicago's underworld, and that made the O'Hare name a dangerous one to carry. Butch's classmates might not have known the details, but Butch did. He could feel his father's time running out like a watch ticking down to an explosion. Still, he pressed on. He graduated from Annapolis in 1937 in the same class as future admirals and legends. His commission came with orders to flight school at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, the proving ground of American naval aviators. For Butch, it was paradise. Pensacola was where the Navy turned mere men into pilots, or wreckage. Flight instructors barked orders, engines roared, and every mistake was potentially fatal. But Butch was born for it. He was smooth on a stick, fast on the throttle, and calm under pressure. Where others wrestled with the aircraft, he made it look like a dance. Instructors noticed. One called him naturally symmetrical, balanced in mind, muscle, and reflex. It wasn't talent alone. Butch studied aerodynamics the way other men studied scripture. He knew that flying was as much mental discipline as physical coordination. While he was learning to defy gravity, the gravity of his father's choices finally caught up with Easy Eddie. In 1939, the call came. His father had been gunned down on a Chicago street, the same city he'd once owned in spirit, if not in law. Butch got the news from his mother in a letter that began, "Your father's gone, son. He did what he thought was right." There was no funeral Butch could attend safely, no public mourning. He absorbed it quietly, as men of his era did. But something changed in him after that. The easy smile stayed, but the gleam behind it hardened. He no longer talked about someday. The Navy wasn't a career anymore. It was a calling. He poured himself into his training, earning his wings of gold later that year. When he received them, he reportedly said only, "Dad would have liked these." It It wasn't boastful, just matter of fact, a quiet acknowledgement of a man who died trying to set things right. In those final months before war erupted across the Pacific, Butch learned to fly the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a stubby-winged brute of a fighter that looked more like a bulldog than a bird. It wasn't fast or sleek, but it was tough, just like him. The day news broke about Pearl Harbor, Butch O'Hare was already in uniform. He'd just finished a routine flight when a fellow officer ran into the ready room shouting, "The Japs hit Hawaii." At first, nobody believed it. Then the teletype clattered to life, printing out line after line of panic. Battleships burning, airfields flattened, thousands dead. America was at war, and suddenly the Navy pilots in their sun-soaked Florida classrooms weren't trainees anymore. They were the first line of defense. For Butch, it was simple. There was no hesitation, no grand speech about duty or revenge. He wanted to fly, and now he would get his chance. He was assigned to Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, under the legendary John "Jimmy" Thatch, one of the sharpest tacticians in naval aviation. Thatch wasn't just a pilot, he was a teacher, and he recognized something rare in Butch O'Hare. O'Hare wasn't reckless like some of the hotshots coming out of Pensacola. He was aggressive but methodical, a man who could fight with both instinct and precision. He could laugh with the crew one moment and be dead serious the next, switching gears like a man flipping a safety switch. That balance made him deadly in the cockpit and reliable in the wardroom. The squadron flew the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a fighter that looked like it had been designed by a drunk bulldozer operator. It was slow, underpowered, and built like a flying oil drum, but it could take punishment like a prize fighter, and in the hands of the right pilot, it could dish it out too. Butch treated the Wildcat like an old friend, knew its quirks, its limits, and exactly how far he could push before it bit back. While training aboard the USS Saratoga, Butch built a reputation as a natural stick and rudder man. He wasn't showy, he didn't pull stunts, he was a craftsman. His landings were textbook perfect. His gunnery scores near the top of the charts. Thatch later said, O'Hare didn't just fly airplanes, he flew them in a way a violinist plays a Stradivarius. It was during this period that Butch met Rita Wooster, a striking redhead with the kind of quiet confidence that could stop a man mid-sentence. They married in 1941, just months before America entered the war. The photos from their wedding show a young couple who seemed utterly unaware of the chaos about to engulf the world. Butch was smiling in his crisp uniform, Rita beaming beside him, both of them radiating that fragile brand of pre-war optimism. He wrote her constantly. His letters weren't poetic, they were simple, grounded, full of affection and the kind of everyday details that becomes precious in wartime. "Don't worry about me," he once wrote. "I've got good men beside me and a good plane under me." By early 1942, Butch's squadron transferred to the USS Lexington, one of the Navy's few operational carriers left in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. The Lexington was more floating city than ship. 3,000 men, engines roaring day and night, planes packed wingtip to wingtip on her flight deck. It was the heart of the Navy's counterpunch. The Pacific in those months was a nightmare map of red arrows and bad news. The Japanese were advancing everywhere. Rabaul, Singapore, the Philippines. The Allied fleets were scattered and bleeding. The United States needed a win, or at least a hero, to remind people that all wasn't lost. Butch didn't think about any of that. He just wanted to fly his next mission and bring his men home alive. VF-3's early sorties were raids on Japanese-held islands in the Marshalls and Gilberts. They were brutal and chaotic, with enemy fire pouring up like rain. The Wildcat's wings rattled from near misses, and the pilots came back with bullet holes through their fuselages and thousand-yard stares behind their goggles. Butch flew as though he'd been doing it his whole life. His calmness under fire impressed even the veterans. He had a way of keeping his voice level on the radio, no matter how bad things got. "Steady, boys," he'd say. "We'll make it back for chow." He also had an odd sense of luck. Once during a strafing run, his engine took a direct hit that cut power just as he cleared the target. He glided the Wildcat over open water for miles before the engine coughed back to life, just long enough to get him home. When he landed, the mechanics found a bullet hole through his oil line and shook their heads. Butch just grinned and said, Guess I'm not due yet. Behind that grin, though, was something harder. He carried his father's death like an invisible weight. He never spoke about it, but the men around him sensed it. Butch flew like a man trying to prove something. Not to the Navy, not to the enemy, but to himself. In February 1942, the Lexington was ordered north to strike Rabaul, a major Japanese base bristling with anti-aircraft guns and fighters. The mission was dangerous, and everyone knew it. The pilots joked to hide their nerves, but even Thatch admitted later that morale was tight as a drum. For Butch, this was it. The moment when everything he trained for, everything he buried from his past, would collide at 15,000 feet above the Pacific. The morning of February 20th, 1942, dawned bright and deceptively calm over the Coral Sea. The USS Lexington was cutting through open water, her decks alive with motion, crews fueling planes, mechanics tightening bolts, signalmen squinting at the horizon. Somewhere out there, invisible beyond the blue haze, was Rabaul, the most heavily fortified Japanese base in the South Pacific. The plan was to hit it hard, then run before the enemy could react. That plan lasted until 10:30 a.m. Radar, still a crude and unreliable tool in those early months, picked up a formation of enemy aircraft inbound from the northwest. A long, slow wave of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, their bellies loaded with torpedoes, were coming straight for the Lexington. 9 of them. VF-3 scrambled its fighters to intercept, but most were already out on patrol. Only 2 Wildcats were close enough to respond. Lieutenant Butch O'Hare and his wingman, Marion Duff DeFillo. They throttled up immediately, engines screaming as the Wildcats clawed into the sky. Within minutes, Butch's radio came alive with tension. Spotters calling the bombers bearing, gunners manning their stations, the carrier turning into the wind. At 14,000 feet, O'Hare and DeFillo sighted them, 9 long green bombers in a tight formation, flying low and steady, their sunlight glinting wings reflecting like knives. The 2 fighters rolled into the attack position, climbing above and behind the Japanese formation. Butch gave the order to open fire. DeFillo lined up for his first pass, then squeezed the trigger and nothing happened. Both of his guns had jammed. That left O'Hare alone, 1 man, 8 guns, 9 bombers, and a carrier full of men depending on him. He didn't hesitate. Butch dove out of the sun, closing fast. The Wildcat shuddered under recoils its .50 caliber Browning spat fire. The first Betty's starboard engine erupted in a plume of black smoke. The plane pitched hard, nose up, and spiraled into the sea. Butch pulled up and banked into another attack, slashing across the formation from the opposite side. The second bomber caught fire almost instantly, fuel tanks detonating in midair. By now the Japanese gunners were awake and furious. Streams of tracer fire arced up at him like angry fireflies. O'Hare weaved through it, rolling, climbing, diving again. He came so close on one pass that his propeller chewed through a bomber's tail assembly. He was burning through ammunition fast. Each Wildcat carried just 450 rounds per gun, barely enough for 34 seconds of continuous fire. Butch didn't waste a single bullet. Every burst was short, deliberate, and surgical. The third bomber went down smoking. The fourth tried to break formation and dive for the sea. He followed it through the clouds of debris, cutting loose a final burst that shredded its wing root and sent it cartwheeling into the ocean. He circled back towards the formation's leaders. The Betty's dorsal gunner was hammering away, tracers flashing past the canopy. Butch nosed down, squeezed off another burst, and the bomber disintegrated in midair. 5 kills, possibly 6, depending upon which reports you believe. Either way, it was one of the most extraordinary single-handed actions in naval aviation history. When his ammunition ran dry, O'Hare calmly broke off and headed back towards the Lexington. Over the radio, his voice was measured and professional. "I'm out of ammo, returning to base." The entire dogfight had lasted less than 4 minutes. Back aboard the carrier, the deck crews craned their necks skyward, waiting for him to appear. When his Wildcat came in for landing, oil-streaked and peppered with bullet holes, the flight deck erupted in cheers. His squadron commander, Jimmy Thatch, ran out to meet him. "You just saved the ship, Butch," he said, grinning. The celebration was brief. The crew still had to repel another wave of enemy planes, but none made it through. The Lexington steamed away untouched, alive because one man refused to let fear or odds decide the fight. That evening, the pilots and sailors gathered in the wardroom to review the gun camera footage. As the first film whirred to life, the room fell silent. The black and white images showed Betty bombers exploding, breaking apart, or plunging nose first into the Pacific. O'Hare had done exactly what the reporters said, and then some. Jimmy Thatch filed the after-action report, writing, "Lieutenant O'Hare's actions were of the highest order. His skill and courage undoubtedly prevented serious damage or loss to the Lexington." Word traveled fast. By the time the Lexington reached Pearl Harbor, O'Hare was already a legend. The Navy had found its first ace of World War II. What struck his fellow aviators wasn't just the number of kills, but how coolly he handled it. There was no bravado, no swagger. When a reporter later asked him what it felt like to face 9 bombers alone, he shrugged and said, "I just tried to keep my sights on one plane at a time." The press turned him into the perfect wartime symbol. Young, clean-cut, polite, fearless. The kind of man mothers could point to and say, "That's what an American looks like." His father's past wasn't buried, but it was reframed. Easy Eddie's son had become the very thing Eddie had prayed he'd be, honorable. The Navy brass understood propaganda, as well as any mob boss understood publicity. They paraded Butch O'Hare through Honolulu, then Washington, D.C. for photographs and interviews. He smiled dutifully, uncomfortable in the spotlight. In private, he wrote to Rita, "All this attention feels strange. I'd rather be flying." When asked by a fellow officer if he felt like a hero, Butch laughed. "Hell, I just didn't want them to sink my ship." It was the kind of humility that made him even more iconic. Behind the medals and newsreels, though, there was an edge of tragedy. Butch knew his father would have read those headlines, maybe even smiled at them. The mob lawyer who died trying to do right, and the son who'd lived long enough to prove that redemption could run in the family. For the first time, America had a hero born from sin. A story too good for Hollywood to invent. On April 21, 1942, the White House lawn was immaculate. Rows of tulips, bright sunlight, and a breeze just strong enough to flutter the flags behind the podium. The war in the Pacific was still going badly, but for one afternoon, Washington had something to celebrate. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself was waiting in his wheelchair, smiling warmly as a young naval aviator approached. Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare stood at attention as Roosevelt pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest. The citation was read aloud in the even, practiced voice of a Navy aide. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in aerial combat, single-handedly attacking a wave of 9 enemy bombers, shooting down 5 and saving his ship from certain destruction. When the last word was spoken, the small crowd of officers, politicians, and reporters broke into applause. Butch, ever the modest one, simply nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." There was no grand speech, no swagger, just the quiet professionalism of a man who'd done his job and didn't see the point in talking about it. His wife, Rita, stood nearby, radiant in her blue dress. Roosevelt took her hand and said, "You must be very proud, Mrs. O'Hare." She smiled politely and replied, "Yes, Mr. President, though I'd rather he stay out of trouble for a while." The room laughed, but Butch only grinned, because he knew he wouldn't. Overnight, Butch O'Hare became America's first naval ace and the Navy's poster boy for courage. His face appeared on the front pages of Life and Time, and he was interviewed by radio announcers who described him as the boy next door who saved a carrier. The nation, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, needed a clean hero, someone who could make the people believe again. Butch fit perfectly, clean-shaven, polite, handsome, and without scandal. The irony, of course, was that behind that wholesome image was a family name once whispered in the same breath as Al Capone's. The Navy press office knew about Easy Eddie, but they never mentioned him. They didn't have to. The story told itself. The son of a man who'd bought his redemption in blood, now earning his own with bullets and bravery. It was a redemption arc straight out of Scripture, dressed in flight gear. During his brief stateside tour, Butch hated the attention. He gave speeches, met dignitaries, and posed for endless photos. To the press, he was unfailingly courteous but restless. He didn't drink much, didn't chase fame, and didn't enjoy the spotlight. He'd rather talk with mechanics about fuel mixtures or with young pilots about approach angles. Fame was a nuisance, war was real. Rita, for her part, handled the celebrity better than he did. When reporters asked how it felt to be married to a national hero, she said, "It's nice, but he still forgets to take out the trash." That kind of grounded humor made the couple endearing to a public desperate for something normal in a world gone insane. Behind the medals and smiles, Butch kept training. He joined his old commander, Jimmy Thach, in refining aerial tactics for fighting the Japanese Zero, a plane faster, lighter, and more maneuverable than anything the U.S. Navy had. The result was the Thach Weave, a simple but ingenious maneuver that allowed slower American fighters to cover each other and turn the tables on their opponents. It would later save countless lives across the Pacific. Thach also credited Butch as one of the men who helped test and refine it. He had a natural sense for what worked in the air, Thach said later. He didn't just think about dogfighting, he thought about survival. Even during his post-Medal of Honor tour, Butch pushed for permission to return to combat. The Navy was reluctant to risk its golden boy, but he was persistent. He wanted back on a carrier, back with his squadron, back where things made sense. While he was home, he also found time for family. In 1943, Rita gave birth to their daughter, Kathleen. Photographs show him holding the baby in his arms, looking both proud and uncomfortable, like a man used to holding a control stick instead of a newborn. But for all of his awkwardness, the joy on his face is unmistakable. He'd survived the impossible, became a hero, and built a family. It should have been a turning point, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he'd earned a little peace. But heroes rarely get to retire early. When the Lexington was lost later in 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Butch took it personally. He'd saved her once, but he couldn't save her twice. The next time he took command, it would be aboard the USS Enterprise, a carrier that had already seen more action than any other ship afloat. Before he left, a reporter asked what he thought about the Medal of Honor. Butch paused, then said, "It's not mine. It belongs to every man who went up there that day and every man who didn't come back." It wasn't false modesty, it was conviction. The kind of humility that doesn't come from being taught, but from knowing just how thin the line between glory and death really is. As 1943 unfolded, Butch O'Hare was no longer just a symbol of what America had done. He was becoming the symbol of what it would still have to endure. A long, bloody, grinding war across an ocean the size of eternity. He didn't care about symbols, he just wanted to fly. By late 1943, the USS Enterprise had earned the nickname the Big E, the most battle-hardened carrier in the Pacific, a floating fortress that had survived when others didn't. She'd been bombed, strafed, and patched up more times than anyone could count, and now she was sailing again, this time toward the newly invaded atolls of Tarawa and Macon. On board was Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, back where he belonged, the cockpit of a fighter plane and the deck of a ship that never stopped moving. Butch had changed since the White House lawn. The clean-cut ace was now a seasoned commander. He carried himself with quiet authority, firm but approachable, professional but never pompous. His pilots adored him. He treated even the greenest ensign with the same respect he gave a veteran. "You do your job, I'll have your back," he told them. Simple, direct, and ironclad. The Wildcats he'd once mastered had been replaced by the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a beast of a machine, faster, tougher, and finally able to match the Japanese Zero. Butch loved it instantly. "She climbs like an elevator and hits like a freight train," he wrote home to Rita. "Perfect lady." But a new problem was emerging, one even the best fighter couldn't fix. The Japanese had begun launching night attacks. Torpedo bombers, the same type he'd faced near Rabaul, now flew under the cover of darkness, gliding low over the waves to strike the carriers when their defenses were blind. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. The eerie drone of engines in the black sky, the sudden explosions on the horizon, and the helpless feeling of fighting an invisible enemy. The Navy had no established night fighter doctrine. Radar was still primitive, and the Hellcats weren't equipped for it. Butch, restless and methodical, started experimenting. He'd seen what radar could do when paired with the right pilot. If they could combine a radar-equipped TBF Avenger, a torpedo bomber with room for a radar operator, and a fast Hellcat, maybe, just maybe, they could intercept those raiders before they reached the fleet. The idea was dubbed the Bat Team. The Avenger would fly ahead, its radar operator calling out bearings to the Hellcat behind, guiding the fighter toward the target like a sightseeing dog in the dark. It was clumsy, untested, and dangerous. Flying formation at night without lights was asking for disaster, but O'Hare volunteered to test it himself. His peers thought he was crazy. He was a Medal of Honor recipient, a national symbol, a man the Navy couldn't afford to lose. Butch brushed it off. If it's dangerous, he said, that's exactly why I should be the one to try it. He flew the first missions himself, working closely with Lieutenant Commander John Phillips, an Avenger pilot with radar experience, and Lieutenant Skull Scahn, one of the best young fighter pilots aboard the Enterprise. Together they tested the formation, refining radio protocols, distances, and approach angles. The system began to work, barely. On several occasions, they intercepted Japanese bombers before they reached the fleet. It was the dawn of modern night interception. Then came November 26, 1943. The Battle of Tarawa was winding down, but Japanese aircraft from the Marshalls was still harassing the task force. The Enterprise Air Group was exhausted. That night, radar picked up another formation of incoming bombers. Butch volunteered to lead the intercept. The team launched just after sunset. The sky was moonless, black as ink. The only light came from the carrier's wake far below, a faint white scar across the sea. The formation was simple. Phillips in the radar-equipped Avenger, O'Hare's Hellcat off his right wing, and Scahn flying cover slightly behind. They climbed to 1,500 feet, listening to the slow hum of their engines and the clipped, precise directions from the radar operator. Target bearing 325, range 10 miles, closing fast. Somewhere out there in the dark were Japanese Betty bombers, each carrying a torpedo big enough to tear the Enterprise in half. Phillips guided them toward the enemy. The tension was suffocating. Even with radar, the sky was chaos. No visual horizon, no sense of motion, just instruments and instinct. Then, through the blackness, O'Hare spotted faint silhouettes ahead. Long wings, steady navigation lines. Contact 11 o'clock high, he radioed. They closed fast. O'Hare broke formation and dived, pulling in behind the lead bomber. He fired a short burst, tracers lancing through the dark, and saw his round strike home. The bomber flared briefly, burning, then vanished below. In that instant, everything disintegrated into confusion. The Avenger's turret gunner, thinking a Japanese plane had dived through the formation, opened fire. Scahn saw tracers streaking in every direction, enemy and friendly alike. Then a voice crackled over the radio. I'm hit, I'm going down. It was O'Hare. Scahn tried to spot him, banking hard, but there was nothing. No flames, no splash, no parachute. Just darkness and silence. The radar operator in the Avenger reported seeing a brief blip disappear from the scope. Then the sky was empty again. They circled for nearly 20 minutes, calling his name over the radio, scanning the waves. No response. At dawn, search planes combed the area, but they found nothing. No wreckage, no oil slick, no trace of the Navy's most famous aviator. The Pacific had swallowed him whole. The official report was careful and vague. Lieutenant Commander O'Hare failed to return from a night combat mission, presumed killed in action. Among his men, theories abounded. Some believed he'd been shot down by a Japanese gunner. Others whispered about friendly fire, that a stray burst from the Avenger's turret might have hit him by mistake. No one would ever know for certain. When the Enterprise's chaplain held a memorial service that evening, the hangar bay was silent except for the low hum of the engines. Hundreds of sailors stood in rows as the chaplain read his eulogy. When he said, he gave his life in the line of duty, a few men looked down, holding their tears. Butch had been more than a commander. He'd been proof that courage didn't always come from perfect men. Sometimes it came from men trying to fix the sins of their fathers. A week later, Rita O'Hare received the telegram. It was short, cold, and final. She read it once, folded it neatly, and sat in silence for an hour before calling her parents. She'd known the risk, but she hadn't expected it to come this soon. The Navy posthumously awarded him the Navy Cross for his final mission and added his name to the long list of men who'd vanished into the Pacific. Heroes whose bodies were never found, but whose stories would never die. And somewhere in the black waves off Tarawa, the son of a Chicago lawyer who traded sin for redemption disappeared into legend. The telegram confirming Butch O'Hare's death reached Chicago in December 1943, though the Navy had known it for weeks that the odds of survival were zero. Rita didn't weep publicly, and she didn't ask for a body. She knew there wouldn't be one. The Pacific didn't give back what it took. She kept one of his flight gloves in a small box on her dresser, still faintly smelling of oil and salt air. When the news hit the papers, America grieved the loss of its first naval ace. For a nation still clawing through the bloodiest moments of the war, O'Hare's name had meant something sacred, proof that decency could still rise out of corruption, that courage could grow from broken soil. Radio stations replayed Roosevelt's words from the Medal of Honor ceremony, and Hollywood stars like Jimmy Stewart mentioned his name in interviews. He wasn't just a pilot anymore, he was a story. Rita received hundreds of letters from strangers, widows, pilots, mothers, school children, each one thanking her for her husband's sacrifice. She answered a few, but most went unread. Grief, she discovered, doesn't like company. She raised their daughter, Kathleen, quietly, always keeping Butch's memory alive without turning it into a shrine. "Your father was a good man," she would tell her. "He did what he thought was right." The war rolled on, swallowing names faster than the papers could print them. But somehow Butch's name stayed. Maybe it was because of how he fought, or maybe because of who his father had been. Easy Eddie's ghost was still floating around Chicago, part of the mythology of Al Capone's empire. It made the son's story irresistible, the gangster's boy who'd redeemed the family name with valor and sacrifice. Even cynical reporters couldn't help but write it like a parable. In 1949, 6 years after his disappearance, the city of Chicago made it official. The city council voted unanimously to rename its new airport O'Hare Field in honor of Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare. A bronze plaque went up in the terminal with his Medal of Honor citation. Next to it, in a small glass case, sat another plaque, this one telling the story of his father, Easy Eddie. It didn't glorify him, it just told the truth. That he had once been a lawyer for Al Capone, that he had risked his life to give the government evidence that helped put Capone behind bars, and that he had been murdered for it, leaving behind a son who grew up to fight and die for his country. The message was clear, almost biblical. Redemption runs in the blood if you let it. Visitors still walk past that display today without realizing the symmetry of it. Two Edwards, father and son, each killed for trying to do the right thing, just in different worlds. One traded in ledgers and bootleg liquor, the other in dogfights and tracer fire. Between them lay the strange, crooked line of American morality, where sin and virtue often share the same last name. Butch's legacy went far beyond Chicago. His Medal of Honor set the standard for every naval aviator who came after. His night fighting tactics, born in the darkness and chaos, became the foundation for U.S. Navy night operations for decades. The Bat Team concept evolved into radar intercept squadrons, then into the jet age. Every pilot who flew combat missions under moonlight owed a quiet debt to the man who vanished in the Pacific. His daughter grew up knowing her father only through stories and photographs. The smiling man in flight gear, the medals gleaming on his chest. She visited O'Hare Field as a child and watched planes roar down the runway that bore her family name. She once said in an interview, "Every time I see a plane take off, I like to think he's up there somewhere, clearing the path." Rita eventually remarried, but she kept Butch's letters in a small box for the rest of her life. The ink had faded, but the last one he wrote before the final mission still read clearly. "Tell Kathleen her daddy loves her very much. I'll be home soon." He wasn't, of course, but men like that never really come home. They just become part of the country's bloodstream. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Chicago's largest airport, the gateway for millions of travelers every year, was named after a man who never made it back to land. The city that had once been built on crime and corruption had chosen to immortalize a man who rose above both. Maybe it was atonement, maybe it was pride, maybe both. When travelers walk through Terminal 2 today, they pass under a sign reading, "Welcome to O'Hare International Airport." Beneath it, a display case holds Butch's Medal of Honor, Navy Cross, and photos of him smiling from a cockpit that no longer exists. Most people never stop to look. They're rushing to catch flights, worried about delays, baggage, and boarding groups. But if they did pause for a moment, they'd see something remarkable. Not just a hero's medals, but a family's redemption frozen in glass. It's a strange kind of immortality, the kind built not on monuments or speeches, but on terminal gate and the sound of jet engines. The noise that once symbolized war now marks the rhythm of everyday life, and somewhere in that mechanical roar is the echo of a wildcat's guns over the Pacific. Butch O'Hare was 29 years old when he vanished. 29 years to grow up, to live down his father's shadow, and to define what courage looked like for an entire generation. Easy Eddie couldn't have written a cleaner ending if he'd tried. The man who'd spent his life defending a criminal finally found his absolution in a son who defended a nation. In the end, the O'Hare story isn't really about crime or heroism. It's about the line between them, and how one man's redemption can become another's inheritance. Easy Eddie bought forgiveness the only way he knew how, by dying for it. His son earned it the only way a man like him could, by flying straight into hell and not flinching. Chicago gave its heart to the son and buried the father in anonymity. But history, in its quiet way, kept them together. One wrote the ledger, the other erased it. So the next time you walk through O'Hare International Airport, look for a monument at the blue and gold insignia mounted on the wall. Behind that emblem isn't just a hero. It's a man who proved that bloodlines don't decide who you are. Choices do. Because in Chicago, Easy Eddie O'Hare bought redemption with bullets, and his son, Butch, earned it with his own. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.